Hello, friends, Romans, countrymen. This is Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. We're recording this on Thursday, the 22nd of July, but you're no doubt hearing this sometime in August.
I'm doubt.
Alex. Huh?
No doubt.
No doubt, and doubtlessly.
They've lent us their ears, so they are listening.
I don't know why you rolled your eyes, George. That was a good intro.
Yeah, I'm Alex Hochuli. If you don't know, I'm here with George Hoare, actually in his flat, and Philip Cunliffe, also in George's flat.
Yeah. How's it going?
Yeah, all right.
Yeah, that is factually correct.
Yep. We were thinking about something to talk about at the beginning here, and I've not been reading the news. I don't know what's been going on.
Why haven't you
in the
been
world.
reading the news, man?
Well,
You're supposed to be a podcaster, a professional
I'm
fucking
on a sort
podcaster.
of like semi-holiday, like kind of working but kind of not, and I don't know.
It's been unseasonably hot recently in Britain, as in it's been
the
hot.
last recourse of English conversation.
Yeah, always.
I like
Always.
talking about the weather.
Of course you do.
I like thinking about the weather and what the weather's doing. I wish I knew meteorology so I could kind of be like, oh yeah, high pressure, but it's blocked by a kind of
Spectrumy.
Why? Do you want to be a weatherman?
No, I mean
You don't need to be a weatherman
I'm not camp
to-
enough to be a weatherman. I think.
You don't need to be a weatherman to know
Definitely camp enough to
know which
weatherman.
way the wind blows.
But why are you not reading the news, Alex?
No, I it's because I get these newsletters, daily. Like I get like one from the FT, one from like G0, which is quite good about global politics, and one from El País Brasil, and like I've just not been reading.
Very, very cosmopolitan.
Which is
very international.
Well, I mean, I have to keep up with what's going on in Brazil and Latin America, and kind of then like global/England. And the thing is that this is also why George was horrified earlier to see that I've got like 1,198 unread emails in my inbox. Partly, I would say a big chunk of those are those newsletters.
Some of those from George as well.
It was
boring
1,000.
emails you don't have to read.
George just saying thank you. Yes, nice. Thank you for sending an email. I'm having the last word.
Okay,
Exactly.
two points. One, it was 1,188. That number is burnt onto my retina.
Bureaucratic retina.
And secondly, if somebody sends you an email and you reply, it's not like, oh, look, this person, what the OCD behavior, they're so anal. Oh my God. It's like, yeah, I'm just saying thank you or just replying, just communicating like a normal human being.
I'm still here. In case you want to
Stalinism,
send me another
George.
email, we can
Yeah.
keep this human connection going.
Anyway,
Please touch me.
What I would add to these newsletters is Substacks. I like Substacks a lot because you don't have to go to the hassle of like www.ft.com. I mean, that's who's
real.
got time for that? Instead, straight to your inbox.
I'm so busy. I can't. I need to wear the same shirt every day because I can't spend time thinking about
also,
it.
who's
And I can't
still
type
typing
in
out www, which
WWFT.
you haven't had to
There
do
is
for
this
10
thing.
years.
Yeah, exactly. There's this thing called
Anyway, the
bookmarks.
Substack thing, because you're always pushing these like different Substacks.
Yeah.
And
So particularly, I would say Sensible Captain Substack. Everyone should subscribe to that one. Angela Nagel's as well. We've talked about that previously. There are loads of other good ones.
And they're both
Propaganda. That's
they're
very
both
good.
guests we've had on the podcast.
Yeah.
As well.
No, I mean, I think it's I like receiving
You
emails.
You
like reading things that you already agree with.
Yeah.
So you're just like, no, this isn't my comfort zone. Yeah, cool. I'm on board with this. Yeah, right on.
So you just like reading? So, oh yeah, I hate all of this. It's all wrong. It's all terrible.
That's
Like,
pretty much the experience.
Actually,
of my
sometimes
life, yeah.
analysis it is useful to read Marxist analysis of stuff because it's correct and it helps you understand things. I mean, if you're just reading it to just get annoyed and dunk on some idiot, then yeah, go ahead.
The news used to be about learning about objective things that happen in the world, but
I prefer opinions. Facts, so much the worse for facts. I mean, I want opinions. I want to know what to think, not what's happening.
Anyway, so we're here actually to discuss Paolo Gerbaudo's new book, The Great Recoil. Actually, we're not going to discuss the book. What we're doing is interviewing him. You're going to hear me interviewing him in just a little bit.
But the interview is about the book.
The interview is about his book, the new book, The Great Recoil, which is out in September. I talk about that in the interview, so I don't need to preview it anymore. But for those who don't know, Paolo Gerbaudo is a previous guest. He's a friend of the podcast. Has blurbed our book, in fact, The End of History, which actually has it kind of goes quite along the same tracks, I suppose, as the Great Recoil. So it's a book about what comes after neoliberalism.
His book on digital parties was, I think, it was very clarifying for the book. In terms of the way in which the new kind of parties, 5-star and all that, the digital kind of plebiscitarian model they have, internal referendums and all that. It was very insightful and useful for us, I think, and helped to clarify aspects of the way in which kind of populist politics works.
Yeah, probably worth checking out, listener, actually, if you haven't listened to that one. I mean, I think it's I can't remember, 65. We'll put it in the show notes, actually. Worth checking out because that was a really sharp book, which we really enjoyed, which seized onto something kind of new happening with these kind of new forms of populist parties, which now feels a bit old hat. I mean, our book talks about the death of left populism. We've talked about it endlessly on this podcast. And nevertheless, those forms of kind of circumventing the void between, political leaderships and parties and ordinary citizens are, they use technical means to do that, to bridge that gap.
Circumventing the old reach around. I mean, so the idea that's an Arrested Development line, I believe. The idea in the book is that you have the hyper leader and the base of the party, of these digital parties, which are disintermediated. So basically, you kind of short circuit all of the previous party apparatuses, and you have this feeding,
like
all
branches, cadres, like various levels of hierarchy, all the rest of it.
You don't need these apparatchiks. You don't need these functionaries. Instead, you just have much purer, quicker, better, more democratic, more cooler, except more trendy, technological way to link the members of a party to the leader, and it
paradoxically
empowers the leader.
Recapitulates the void in the inside of the party.
Yeah.
So
and it will never. It's in. I don't think Paolo has this in the book, but it's that's one of the kind of critiques of populist politics.
5-star having been reabsorbed into kind of mainstream Italian party politics in coalition with the Democratic Party, governing Democratic Party. I think vindicates Paolo's perspective about the limits of these populist parties as vehicles.
I bloody love Cinque Stelle 5-star. I think it's the purest populist party in Europe. It's a fascinating thing to study, and it's also so telling and also so foreseeable that it's ended up completely folded into the kind of mainstream establishment, because it was so catch-all and so just anti-political that, as we've always argued, anti-politics leads back to technocracy.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Or to dictatorship, alternatively. That's the other road that it kind of takes. But
yeah, I think it's that idea of political authority. I mean, I've made this point before. That's what's really lacking and what is really important. But yeah, why don't we call Paolo up now? And
the artifice of here. I spoke to Paolo a couple of days ago, but
but you need to have the ringing.
We're calling Paolo. Hi, Paolo.
But you're actually you did it with him live in his flat, right? So we don't actually need to ring him up.
Anyway, the listeners will get this when they actually hear it. Anyway, that's enough from us. Listen to me talking to Paolo. All right, everyone, I'm here with Paolo Gerbaudo in his flat in London. Thank you for having me, and thank you for coming on.
Welcome, Alex.
So, how's it going? You're obviously Italian, and it's a great time to be Italian because you have neo-fascists or post-fascists leading the polls in Italy. You have followed by right-wing populists and followed by centrist neoliberals. No, that's not the reason that it's good to be Italian. The reason it's good to be Italian is because Italy had a really great pandemic and no one died and there were no civil liberties. Oh no, that's not the reason it's good to be Italian. I'm trying to remind me, what's the reason that it's good to be Italian now?
It has come to Rome, man.
Yeah.
Eventually.
Yeah. That and more importantly, winners of Eurovision, which is of course an unprecedented double.
Yes, now there's many articles that are talking about the resurgence of Italy. I mean, the New York Times, there was recently an article that Italy is back, and it is because of Mario Draghi, obviously, right?
Oh yeah, Super Mario, who technocrat in chief. Yeah, so what we're actually here to do is talk about your book. This is actually the second time you've been on. We talked about your excellent book, The Digital Party, before, and this was maybe about, 2018 or something like that?
Before the pandemic, so it feels like another decade.
It is another
2 years
decade,
ago, yeah.
And it was also kind of peak populism period, I think, in a way that maybe doesn't really feel like that now, right? And your book is about that. So your book is called The Great Recoil: Politics After Populism and Pandemic, which is out soon on Verso. September, excellent. And it's a book that you were just telling me before this that you started writing in 2017, which feels also like a very different time. It was precisely when like left populism was on the up. It seemed like something quite promising, and at the same time, the pandemic was something which only experts were warning about, while politicians paid it no heed, and has actually come home to roost. So what was the process of writing it like, actually, given that you started a long time ago and lots of things have happened since then?
Yes, I think writing political theory books these days is very difficult as the terrain is constantly changing, and it feels sometimes you're really kind of trying to grasp some things, some figures in the darkness. But at the same time, somehow some of the themes that were already there embryonically in the late 2010s ended up resonating with what has happened after now with the pandemic. Because, I mean, I say my chief concern in writing this book was that I was dissatisfied with the theory of populism. It seemed to me as if it had lost its explanatory ability in a time when so many things had become populist.
Yeah.
At a time when all politics is populist somehow. Talking about populism seemed to make less and less sense.
Populism is something that you don't like, especially if you're like a liberal centrist. Populism just means anything that you don't like, right?
Yes, but also for the people that like populism, as I do, you were realizing that as everything was becoming populist, the left was considered populist, the right was considered populist, even some liberal centrists were described as populist, such as Macron, having some kind of populist rhetoric. You start wondering, so what's the entire point talking about populism now? Indeed, the 2010s were the time when politics became populist, but now we are in a different stage. Somehow we are in a different stage of the decline of neoliberalism, of which the populist wave was part, and a point where neoliberalism eventually seems to be giving way to something different.
Yeah.
This is the central thesis in the book.
Yeah, so exactly that. I was going to come on to that. I mean, the basic idea of the book is what happens after neoliberalism. And you characterize, and many times throughout the book, about a turning inwards that's happening after neoliberalism. And that's a kind of recoil, as in the title, to kind of flinch back from from this sort of openness or globalization that happened before. One way you try to capture this is through terms which I hadn't really heard before: endopolitics versus exopolitics. So maybe you could explain what those terms mean and how they refer to the changes that are happening now, moving beyond neoliberalism.
Yes, what I wanted to do with the book was, in a way, reading, on the one hand, the theory of neoliberalism at a time of its decline. A bit like, right, I mean, we know that all ideologies become clearer at the time of their decline. So I read a lot of founding text of neoliberalism. It was a very hard thing to do, but I did it, and I learned quite a lot from that. And what struck me doing that was how much there was a very profound leitmotif to all these texts, which was this idea basically of slamming open the cage of the state and any social unit, so to unleash the genius of entrepreneurialism, finance, and economic spontaneity. And all the talking there was about externalization. That's where the idea of exopolitics come from. So to me, really, topologically, the push of neoliberalism was about going out in the open, the imaginary of globalization as a new Wild West. Now even entrepreneurs like going to space, they always want to go farther and farther so that the global market can find ever more countries or spaces to occupy. But as we know from Polanyi, cycles of capitalism ultimately crash against the shoals of reality, against the limits of the environment, against the limits of the economy, against the limits of politics, and then tend to wash back.
Yeah, and so like just for listeners, the Polanyi's idea, I guess very briefly, is a sort of double movement where you have the deterritorialization or the kind of openness of the market, which then brings forth a sort of natural and spontaneous counter reaction towards protection, I guess. Is that how you would...
Completely. That's the description of Polanyi that obviously referred to the 30s, to the 1930s, to the crisis of 1929, the Wall Street crash, and how different countries experienced this trajectory in different ways. So either the social democratic or liberal progressive response, which was obviously Roosevelt and the New Deal, the fascist and the Nazi response in Europe, or the Bolshevik response. They were all very different responses, but they all responded to the same crisis, to the same dilemma, which was how do we protect society from capital, from the rapacity of capitalism, which precisely at the time of crisis is becoming self-destructive. It's called self-cannibalizing. And, inwardness, in interiority, in navel gazing, I think some people associate these words with navel gazing, something negative.
Yeah,
right?
sort of somehow narcissistic or something.
Yeah, but in fact, it's not always the case. In a sense, it's quite normal, I think, in common sense, in folk tales, right? That in moments of crisis or difficulty, people have for a period to internally reorganize, or societies need to reorganize internally. And precisely because of this shock of the fact that externalization has produced exposure, produced a sense of being out in the open. Yeah, there is now a natural instinct to find, in a way, a new equilibrium or some degree of shelter. Vis-a-vis a space that otherwise feels like extremely threatening.
I mean, these metaphors are really interesting, and we're going to talk about some other ones, I guess, that appear throughout the book. Some involve animals, so for listeners, that's always fun, animals coming up. But also, I wanted to maybe just throw in some other kind of metaphors that are used. I mean, the Openness Closed one, which is probably kind of stupid one that's often used, and one which is... really beneficial to those who are in favor of openness, because who wants to be closed, right? It doesn't sound that endearing. But also on this podcast before, we talked with Anton Jaeger about where he was talking about, we talked once about public and private phases of capitalism, and some that kind of maps on in a way to neoliberalism as a private phase. And then maybe we move to a more public phase now, whereas, the social democratic period after the Second World War was a public phase, and so on. So it's kind of interesting, just maybe, I guess, to bear these sorts of notions in mind as we go forward. Because there's another one I'm going to bring up now, is that we're moving, I guess you make the argument in the book, to an agoraphobic world, right? So it's fear of open spaces. And that's another way you kind of try to capture through a kind of in a metaphorical sense, big changes which relate both to economic management, all the way to culture, to kind of forms of politics, right? So maybe you could tell us what is our agoraphobic moment?
Agoraphobia is a form of anxiety, right? It's one of many forms of anxiety. We know that we live in an age of anxiety. Anxiety fundamentally is a condition of that is correlated with a sense of lack of control. Is when a person doesn't feel able to determine the course of events, and is somehow accelerated. The thought is accelerating, so one is worrying so much about the past, what may happen in the future, that he's not able anymore to control the present, to have a sense of direction, a sense of steering the course of events. Now, this term is also, I think, a good metaphor to express many of the anxieties that pervade our era, because I think that much of our politics has to be understood in light of those social anxieties. These social anxieties have to do with the sense of being in a space that is traversed by very powerful flows of money, of commodities, of services, of people that are often out of collective control.
Yeah.
People cannot determine them. This is an anxiety that is very general. I mean, on the right, it would be obviously the inability to control the flow of people, migration. On the left, instead, is the inability to control flows of money, flows of commodity, flows of capital.
I guess there's few sections of society that feel totally at home in this world. I mean, it's the most elite sections, people who are... especially effectively the global elite, financial elite, who are happy with this openness and can benefit from it. But for most other people across the political spectrum, you feel exposed.
Yeah, right? People who are at the receiving end of these flows. and to give an example that to show that it is not just necessarily a kind of reactionary anxiety. I mean, let's give the example, for example, of Barcelona and protest against tourism. Before the pandemic, Barcelona, as many other cities that were very attractive to tourists, have been literally kind of flooded by hundreds of thousands of tourists, creating problems for local inhabitants, people who are actually living in a place. And these are in terms of rents going up because of Airbnb. It's in terms of not being able to use your parks or services anymore because they're flooded with other people that sometimes get really drunk and noisy and create all sorts of nuisances. And therefore, you have these campaigns that are basically, I want to save my neighborhood, right? Also here in London, for example, there is a campaign to save the Ridley Road market from gentrification, regeneration. And I think this instinct of defense actually is really important. I mean, in the desire of inhabitants, to use the term of Karl Polanyi, vis-a-vis what is presented as innovation, is actually something that is really important for developing an alternative. I mean, sometimes it is taken as a kind of conservative struggle or sometimes associated with NIMBYism. But there are very important reasons why people are not happy with those things happening to them in the place where they live.
Well, and I guess we'll get on to whether that move to protect, to exert some sort of control is necessarily parochial, or if it can be a sort of grander sort of politics and political response. But before that, I guess we should talk about populism, because you said it out quite clearly at the beginning, saying populism is the dialectical negation of neoliberalism. But for me, I find that populism is precisely an undialectical negation, that it's merely its mirror image or the shadow of neoliberal managerialism, that in some ways it's unable to get beyond anything. And that's something that you say later on in the book, that that populism equals anti-neoliberalism, and this is precisely its limit, that it never goes beyond countercultural contestation. So how do you see populism? Do you see it as something that's able to kind of transgress or move beyond, transcend what we have now, or is it merely just a kind of spontaneous, automatic reaction to neoliberalism and in some ways negative reflection of neoliberal managerialism's own image, right? So the managerial say, let's be open, populists say, let's be closed. Managerial say, let's submit things to the market. No, let's not. And so on.
Completely. I think in 21st century populism somehow has been the doppelganger of like the twin brother of neoliberalism, or the inverted brother of neoliberalism in some respects, because they have so many similarities in that they both reflect the extreme individualization, right? That neoliberalism has created and that populism is exploiting. Because with anything in society, if you push certain things to the extreme, in the case of neoliberalism, competition, individualism, you're always bound to have some negative feedback responses. We know this from the theory of complex systems. So what happens is that over the course of neoliberalism, typically you have some communitarian waves that are precisely there to balance out the centrifugal tendencies of neoliberalism, this extreme individualism that creates scores of victims that then want to be reintegrated in the system, want to be reintegrated in society. Because, I mean, we know that from anthropology, from biology, from sociology, human beings as any animals, I mean, they are not really individuals. They live in communities, they live in groups, they live in bands. Capitalist modernization has produced individual atomization. Over the course of the social democratic era, unions and parties managed to find a new settlement, also in the terms of creating a new sense of community, making people feel at home somewhere in their neighborhood, in their workplace, in their community. But then obviously with neoliberalism, that sense of community is eroded. And this is now why we find ourselves now in this situation.
So one thing that's emerging, and this is something that, regular listeners to the podcast will know that we've talked about this as well, and this is kind of where the contemporary thinking is going. You put it quite clearly, and it's actually a great way that you go about explaining what this synthesis looks like, that that after the populist decade, effectively, what you have is a protective statism. Protective statism, which is a meta-ideological horizon. And by this, you mean it's something that infuses the entire political space, that everybody left, right, and center will have to adapt to this protective statism. So maybe you could explain what this synthesis is, and maybe give us some examples of some who you feel are like characteristic politicians, so people can put some meat on those bones.
Yes, I mean, first and foremost, statism is an ideology that sees the state as the motor of society, as a fundamental infrastructure, which is in a way the inversion of many of neoliberalism's viewpoint, in a sense that neoliberalism was strongly anti-statist, right? One of the main polemical targets of neoliberalism was always the state, the nanny state, the gravy train, red tape, and so on and so forth. Now, that is not the case anymore. Actually, it has not been the case for a long time. I mean, already 2008 demonstrated that the market cannot exist without the state, that the state has to intervene to bail out companies, that companies exist as long as the state wants them to be there and wants to save them. And with the pandemic, it has become ever more evident. Now, as at any moment of ideological transition, things are quite muddled. They're not as clear in the transition phase as one may want them to be. But for example, the huge stimulus programs, over 5 trillion already approved in the US under Biden, the recovery plan in Europe, though much smaller, point to a different horizon where some pillars of neoliberalism, specifically monetary conservatism, fiscal conservatism, and free trade, are falling. Others are not. I mean, like low taxation, social Darwinism, the right still retain them. But other ones that had to do precisely with the role of the state in the economy, both domestic and international, are actually giving way to a new statist creed. And I mean, neo-statism as something that is meta-ideological infuses the entire political spectrum. So on the left, it will be this return to the welfare state, this return to public services by the populist left. On the right, it is law and order, it is border walls, it is a return of the repressive state, which wasn't quite there in the center-right of the neoliberal era, at least not in such strong forms. But then you have Bidenomics, right? There is also kind of a liberal response to that. Saying, let's use the activist state to determine how capitalism operates, to change how the market works.
Yeah, I mean, often I've made this argument, before, and people always respond like, "No, but look, Trump passed tax cuts, or the Dutch are still like hardcore Austerians in Europe, and so on." But of course, I think, as you say, it's a muddled situation in which there's still a legacy of neoliberalism. Of you had effectively 40 years of that form of politics, and it'll take a while for it to recede entirely. But I think it's quite clear that the political authority of neoliberalism is certainly over, even if there still remain neoliberal measures and legacies here and there. One thing, I guess, is what has forced this synthesis, because what has forced the establishment to change? What has forced someone like Joe Biden to pursue policies which are effectively a continuation of Trumpism, but probably a bit more effectively done, less circus, but it's effectively Trumpism in a Trumpism in a suit. Trump wore a suit, but Trumpism, I guess Trumpism without the Twitter. That's a way to say it, right? What really forced that change? Because there's a tendency on the left to exaggerate its own contribution, say, we forced them to adopt our policies, or alternatively to scream, how dare these centrists or right-wingers steal our policies. And, the real populist threat seemed to come more from, with certain exceptions perhaps, more from the populist right than the populist left. So, I mean, do you see these adaptations from the even traditional establishment politicians like Joe Biden, like Boris Johnson, as products of what? I mean, what's forced that change? I mean,
I wouldn't underplay the contribution of socialists to this change of discourse, in the sense that I think Biden has realized that young people in the US are becoming ever more anti-capitalist. Those people are now young, so they are just a section of the electorate. But any politician who is a bit more long-sighted knows that these people will be the voters of the future. And I think there's quite solid evidence demonstrating that for socioeconomic reasons, young people are increasingly concerned about capitalism that is not working. But I agree with you that the more important reasons that have led Joe Biden to what I think is a significant change in policy. I mean, one I didn't expect, for example.
Yeah.
And in a way goes against what he has done over his 30, 40 years as senator. Have to do, with Trumpism, precisely, with fear. It has to do with fear. And in the book I said it is an age of fear more than desire.
Yeah.
And also, so politics is defined by fear. Fear of Trumpism. They don't want Trump to come back, nor a Trump lookalike. And this is the liberal establishment as well. I mean, the centrists in the Democratic Party. Because 6th of January 2021, perhaps we don't realize it outside of the US, but people in the US know very well that it was a trauma. It was a very big shock for many people, including for many people at the top.
Yeah.
They don't want that to happen again, and they are ready to make some concessions to avoid that coming back.
Yeah.
These concessions are fundamentally giving a bit more protection or wage rises to workers that are targeted by Trumpism. Second fear of China.
Yeah.
This is again, this is something that Brian Dees explains very well in his interview with Ezra Klein of the New York Times. And Brian Dees says it very well. We have fundamentally realized that the US is increasingly in a weak strategic position vis-a-vis China. We have realized, it is a bit laughable because everyone realized that, but it's good that also liberal centrists come to realize that China is a state capitalism, right?
Yeah.
With the state controlling a large section of the economy. And we have realized that China it is a system that it is working for them. I mean, they have 30,000 kilometers of high-speed trains. The US doesn't even have one.
Yeah.
Right? So we cannot go on pretending that we are in a free market when our main competitor for the US is China. And we cannot go on pretending that China is a complete disaster when actually their model. So in a way, what is alluding to, though he's not saying that explicitly, is that the US has to become a bit more like China.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because in our recent Alpha Bunga Bunga reading club, we discussed Michael Lind's book, The New Class War, and he's quite explicit. I mean, he's obviously, for listeners who haven't read the book and maybe aren't subscribers and haven't had a chance to listen to that, he's a conservative communitarian, I guess, who would fit very well, I think, with as a model of what you're talking about in terms of a turn towards statism. But he makes the argument that elites have never been disciplined effectively by revolution, by the left, that it's always been conflict, the great power conflict that's actually done it, which of course is a conservative interpretation of history, but I mean not completely incorrect in the fact that the destruction of old elites in the First and Second World War did breed a change. But he's quite explicit that basically conflict with China almost needs to happen for the US to carry out a complete reorganization of capitalism and have kind of more pro-social, pro-worker reforms.
Yeah. One of the most infamous lines of Hegel is when he basically justifies war because it gives, it is the highest moment of the nation because it strengthens its identity. And obviously it's not something that anyone would like to happen. But it is true that international pressure sometimes leads elites to realize that certain positions are untenable. I mean, obviously the most egregious example of that is the Soviet Union and the way in which the threat of the Soviet Union contributed to the social democratic settlement in the West for a long time, because they knew that workers were beginning to sympathize for that model. So yes, I think that is perhaps the most important fear of the US. I mean, the US is realized, as someone was saying, once upon a time people were going to the US to see the future. Now they're going to the US to see the past.
Yeah.
Right. And that is not good for the country of the for a country that thought of itself as the country of the future.
Yeah, of course, that Italy is the real country of the future, or
And
Brazil,
Brazil.
yeah.
It's the same thing.
Yeah. So I wanted to dig into a couple of the big themes that form the middle chapters of the book, which are sovereignty, protection, and control. Some of which we've already mentioned. You argue that protection and control are sovereignty's ends and means. That is to say, control is a means to protection. And I wanted to kind of take you up on some of these. Sovereignty is something that we've discussed endlessly on Alpha Bunga Bunga, so probably don't need to dwell too long on it, but just, I guess, one little thing about it, because you have a reading of Hobbes in it and present sovereignty both as territorial sovereignty, state sovereignty, but also popular sovereignty, and I guess, for listeners, they'll be well familiar with at least our discussions of it, if you are a regular listener. But one important point, of course, is that Hobbes allows a breach for rebellion. So it's not just merely the sovereign comes in and provides protection and then you must obey in return, but that there is a social contract that if the sovereign is no longer able to provide protection, then there's a sort of right to rebel. You've introduced that, but you don't answer the question that I guess that hangs over it. Do you think that's been breached? Do you think that the sovereign's supposed social contract to the people has been broken by not providing protection?
I think that is the case in the sense that the neoliberal contract, for sure, that promised people certain things, right? It promised that they would get better. It promised
sort of meritocratic vision of society.
Exactly. I've been reading, for example, some of the declarations in the G8 of Genoa, right? Exactly 20 years ago. You see,
it's 20 years, man. Yeah.
I was seeing the rhetoric there, and it was still this rhetoric of, we need to continue expanding because it's also good for poverty. Actually, globalization is the best way to fight poverty.
Yeah.
And much of that discourse has completely failed, and people already realized that after 2008. But then sovereignty for me is something that started being interesting for me because I realized that it was in a way the content of populism. That in a way, if one wanted to understand what populism was actually about, and if one wanted to find the content of populism, the way to go was sovereignty, because there seemed to be this word popping up everywhere where populism appeared. The two things somehow were entangled.
But both discursively as well as materially, in the sense that the thing that populism opposes is precisely an anti-sovereignty trend in politics. In the organization of society.
Completely, but at the same time, I also realized that the sovereignty people were talking about in so many different occasions, places, food sovereignty of Via Campesina, energy sovereignty of ecological activists, food sovereignty of anarchists, or national sovereignty, that it was not reducible to the juridical notion of sovereignty, right? Nor to territorial sovereignty, right? As normally understood in political science and international relations. It was more of all-encompassing term, basically to speak about power, if you want to put it like that. Political power, which by its nature is always localized, because the demos as a topos, political institutions are defined by place, right, by territory, but then taking very different meanings, because territorial sovereignty and popular sovereignty are actually quite different understandings of what sovereignty is about. The left is the force that has politicized sovereignty in history, as Mélenchon famously said. But the kind of sovereignty that the left has politicized, what was popular sovereignty, the power of the people.
Yeah. No, that's very good. I guess we have to move on to protection and control, because those are, in a way, like the way that you put it, in some ways the keys to understanding or unpacking sovereignty. Protection sounds like, to me, as a political operative word, as something that puts citizens in a passive position, as recipients of protection. But you point out, I think, you argue that it's not just defensive, but that protection is productive of community, which I thought was interesting, and maybe you could explain exactly how that works.
In a way, that speaks to a larger theme of social theory, the asymmetry of society, in a sense that in any relationship, in any interaction, there's always a kind of 80-20 kind of ratio. And in this case, people are defending more than they are attacking in any way. So defense, in the broadest sense of defense of community, defense against enemies, defense against natural threats. I mean, let's think what is happening now in Belgium, in Germany. These
are floods for listeners who,
these huge floods that are, in a way, the anticipation of a likely era of floods that we're going to see in coming years. They speak to, I think, fundamental human fact. The fact that human communities, human societies, human civilization are really fragile by definition. We often don't realize that because we've been lucky enough to live in years where there's been no global war, where security felt better, also crime has gone down. But actually, that's in a way the exception in history. Throughout history, danger, threat, death, ultimately, negativity has been a constant component there. And this is coming back, and it has come back most evidently because with the coronavirus crisis, because the coronavirus crisis really imposed on the public agenda the question of death, right? Which neoliberalism is not a question that likes to talk about. Plus, climate change has only reinforced that message. I don't know if you saw this famous comic of this Canadian comic designer, where there are all these waves that are washing on the coast. The first one is COVID, then there is climate change, and there is biodiversity collapse, right? It really captures something about the spirit of the times in a way.
Yeah.
Like the dominant mood there. The fact that people are ever more aware that there are existential risks that need to be dealt with.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to come on to fear in just a second because there's plenty to talk about there. But just to talk about control then, that the kind of third in that triumvirate of sovereignty, protection, and control, which are the key terms of our age in your book. So you break down control into three different notions, and there's some good evocative sort of imagery around it. So control as command, like the idea of a fist, which sounds quite oppressive. Control as direction, and there you use the imagery of a ship, which is something that you steer, the idea of you can control the direction of society, or of politics, and control as autonomy. So that's sort of as an island. In all of that description, I think I can identify things in politics today which fit those examples, right? And you can have a control as command. You can think of maybe, Viktor Orban's, gutting the constitution and claiming more control. Direction. I'm trying to think of an example, but even Biden's attempt to steer politics in a certain direction, or at least prevent the worst from happening, in some sense of trying to seize control of events in a very limited sense.
That's more to do with exactly controlling events, in a way controlling chance and things that are out of your control. I think
and then as autonomy, that would be at least a certain interpretation of Brexit, for example. Though we can come on to Brexit, I guess, a bit more in a little bit. But I think for me, what I found maybe what was missing from that, or maybe it's my misreading, is a more active sense of control, of Republican freedom, of self-rule, right? And for me, that seems to me the true sense of autonomy. And you do say this in the book, that autonomy is not just being an island, I think, which is the maybe common understanding of the word autonomy, but that autonomy does mean in some sense relates to self-mastery, to kind of control in that kind of more positive sense. So I wonder if maybe you could comment on that first of all.
Yes, I think perhaps the most evident one.
Sorry, just to clarify, actually, because that is something. Do you think that is not important, or do you think that's something that isn't so present in contemporary politics, and so just at a descriptive level, that's something that's not present?
No, I think that is important, and in a way, one of the messages of the book is that a socialist politics needs to be a Republican politics. in the sense that if a socialist agenda has to be pursued, it can only be pursued within a republic. I mean, within a framework, within a republic, in a sense of a commonwealth that is able to self-governance through. Yeah. There's no, obviously, I don't believe in global democracy. I don't believe in global governance. I believe in international relations, international collaboration, international friendship, right? But the idea that you can leapfrog and go beyond the nation state is something that has been demonstrated to be wrong again and again. And I think with the idea of control as the island autonomy is something that obviously the Brexit event brought very much into the public consciousness. There were some famous kind of Remainers posters. No man is an island, right?
Yeah.
And the quip I use in the book is that in a way all countries are islands. This is
it's a good riposte. I like that. Yeah.
Because it's one of the fundamental effects of the nation state to isolate the nation from the rest. This is something that Poulantzas said. So Poulantzas said that the two fundamental effects of the state are individualization and isolation of the nation state unit, right? The idea of different social units. Now, for a long time, postmodern sociology, thinking about Ulrich Beck, they were all about this idea of overcoming the unit idea of sociology, right? Overcoming this idea of units with boundaries.
Yeah.
But that has has created many problems. It is precisely at the root of the feeling of lack of political control. When you break these social units and their internal solidarity. And secondly, we have also seen the stubbornness of these social units, right? In the long term, and how they become important when it comes to crisis.
And it's interesting because that sort of postmodern delusion that there are no boundaries, that we live in a global society and so on, you don't find much theoretical representation of that, and I don't think you find that much political discourse which really affirms that. I mean, there's references to the international community, which we all know means the interests of the United States or of rich countries. But we seem to have moved beyond at least that high point of globalization, which completely relegates the nation state. At the same time, though, I think like in popular consciousness, especially for younger people, because of the internet more than anything and social media, there is a sense of a blurring of the boundaries of what a national culture might be. And that doesn't need to be a conception of a national culture which is parochial or closed off to the world or anything like that, or reactionary in any way, but just that it relates to that culture is a dialogue with a country's dialogue with itself about where it wants to go and whatever. Good stuff, right? Mm-hmm. But there seems to be a remnant of that sort of globalist ideal in the minds of a lot of people today because of the internet. The idea that we live sort of in some global space, that place doesn't matter. So,
yeah, that is true. There is a tension. I think is probably going to be a continuing tension between a globalism that has become ever more kind of almost an hyperglobalism. I mean, to me, the most clearest example was the Football Super League.
Yeah.
Like this idea of just let's create something outside of these stupid national leagues. Yet it always engenders then this reaction from below saying, no, wait a sec, you don't fuck with us.
Yeah.
I mean, we want to keep it close to us because if it goes away, we lose any control, precisely. Yeah. I mean, once it is disanchored from the territory, we, ordinary people, like fans in that case, we lose any pressure point that we can use to assert our interests, fundamentally. But something that struck me, the great thing for me of writing this book was that it gave me the opportunity to read a lot of political theory and political philosophy I hadn't read properly. And that taught me that many ideas that liberals these days are proposing are actually in contradiction with the proper liberal theories of the past. I mean, for example, Kant, right? I mean, the idea of universal peace and the idea of an overcoming of conflicts. I mean, it is an idea that many people have associated with this global democracy, or overcoming of the nation state. Right? So you go and read Immanuel Kant on that, and you may think Kant will argue that we need global democracy. Nothing farther from Kant. When Kant is talking about peace, and is the greatest worry for him is what he calls world government. Because what he says is that world government is dangerous because being a global government, therefore a gargantuan government, it would be much more dangerous. It would have enormous means of destruction at its disposal. It wouldn't have any boundary to contain it in, right?
Yeah.
To stop it from being destructive. Secondly, the centripetal force, imagine a force of gravity in a kind of like solar system, would automatically create a repulsive force at the periphery. As peripheral countries and regions don't like the settlement and therefore they break off. And this would only create conflict, which was precisely the problem that world government would be instituted to solve in the first place.
Yeah. No, that's a good example, I think, of the way that postmodern liberalism and kind of what has been called kind of globalist ideology, whether that's a good term or not, in some ways, it's quite distant. It is, yeah. I think we miss out I think that's a good way to put it, because we miss out precisely how extreme it is, because it's been the common sense of the day for at least 20 years.
Yeah, because liberals in the past, if talking about Kant or talking about Hannah Arendt, these are liberal thinkers. They were far wiser than what these days are called liberals. And they were, by the way, often kind of imbued with civic republican ideas as well.
Yeah.
In a sense, they were for freedom, but they accepted that you need a political community, right? You need boundaries, and that the universal rights of man, of people, are not in contradiction, but are actually realized to the right of the citizens of a specific country.
Yeah, absolutely.
But these days, neoliberals and liberals have completely abandoned this wisdom.
Yeah, which is the ideology of human rights, which rights are things which are not fought for and guaranteed by powers, but just exist somehow in the ether, and ultimately have to be backed up by the United States. So that's who you have to appeal to if you want your rights guaranteed. Otherwise, you're screwed. So that's not good. I want to talk about the flip side of control before we move on to talk about fear, which is there's control in the notion that we were talking about in terms of self-rule, about seizing control, taking back control, to use the Brexit slogan. But there's the other side of skepticism towards state control, which is a sort of perhaps a libertarian stance, or at any rate a very skeptical stance, because I think even if you look at some of the conspiracy theories, they're not necessarily libertarian, but there's a perhaps even a sort of paranoid disposition with regard to state power, and not just state power, but the kind of all its accoutrements and institutional supports, whether it's the media, the judiciary, etc., etc. You know that skepticism towards state control has drawn very different people together, right? So you have like alt-right and the anti-authoritarian left, and that's something that's emerging, which is quite hard to get a grasp on, because on the one hand, it's good that the people are revolting against quite authoritarian impositions. At the same time, it seems very much trapped in something which you're critical of in the book, and something that I'm critical of myself as well, which is the anti-authoritarian critique of top-down control that's existed since the 1960s. This sort of denunciation of anything to do with the state as necessarily oppressive, and a kind of a jealous guarding of, I guess, sort of individual sovereignty at the expense of any collectivity, any normative idea of what society should be like. So how do you understand this, what seems to be kind of an emerging polarization, which isn't captured by left versus right, I think?
That is interesting indeed. If I think about my social media timeline, some of the people that before the pandemic were taking the most, say, sovereigntist, kind of nationalist or quasi-nationalist lines, including people like supporting Brexit or being very critical of the euro. I was actually very surprised to see how many of them then embraced this libertarian criticism of lockdown, of masks, of vaccination. There was the point, I think it was made by a journalist, this point was made by a journalist of the Financial Times, that the big teaching of the pandemic was that Trump, for example, this problem was not that he was an authoritarian. His problem was that he was a libertarian. That actually libertarianism was far more prominent, at least when it comes to kind of domestic policy or to economic policy. right?
Yeah.
So it's a weird mix and match in a way, right? In a sense, is some degree of authoritarianism, in a sense, recuperation of state authority at state level, but then just to allow people to maintain self-control or proprietarian control, right, within the country, in a sort of kind of Darwinist fight of all against all. So indeed, I mean, there was something that was quite remarkable to see this struggle between authoritarians and libertarians, if you want to put it like that, or people who think that control should be collective and people that think that control should be fundamentally individual.
Yeah, though I mean, I guess to complicate that picture, the way I've characterized it is that the pandemic, the battle lines over the pandemic has been between antisocial collectivists, the effectively total pro-lockdown people, and antisocial libertarians. And there's no real true social vision because one is in the name of collective sacrifice, but where everyone's atomized, you're not allowed to see your friends, you're not allowed to decide for yourself how to manage public spaces and how to behave in them. So it's quite an antisocial vision. And then the sort of libertarian response, which also kind of seems to suggest the state should just do nothing. That it's not a realm for the state to be involved in, which I think is also wrong because surely protecting people in a pandemic is one of the core responsibilities of a state.
I mean, some of these issues have been fetishized, and I think also the left has made mistakes there in a way. I mean, thinking that the lockdown was the only solution, or almost attributing kind of salvific power to the lockdown, where ultimately, I would say, the policymakers in the West jumped the gun a bit, in a sense that if you wanted, I think initially it would have been the right idea to pursue a kind of proper hard lockdown, in order then to open up the country, but then closing external borders or subjecting people to quarantines, right, as they did in China, for example.
Yeah.
That's the way they manage the pandemic, despite not having the same vaccination rates that we're having here. But obviously, once you enter these in-between measures, I'll do a bit of that, but I cannot do more than that, otherwise public opinion will completely massacre me. Obviously, that solution by now is already anachronistic.
But I think you do see the two phases of control in all of this, right? Because there is an element of to control from global forces, but also to reject the control imposed on people, while at the same time all the kind of liberal center being generally hardcore advocates of lockdown and wanting to impose control. So we're going to park that discussion now, but I think
people dislike bureaucracy.
Well, yeah, exactly, and they want bureaucracy for other people, but not for them, which I think is what a lot of the polls attest to. That they want lockdown, but then they don't behave, they don't follow them. So, but anyway, just to say that I think that's the way that you've conceptualized it is really interesting in the book, and might as well say this now. I'll say it at the end again, but listeners should pick up a copy of The Great Recoil when it comes out. Let's turn to animals because everyone likes animals. We're going to talk about pangolins. I should have looked up how to pronounce it properly before this, and lobsters. Right, so these
it's
are
the
two.
most beautiful animal.
Is it?
Pronunciation.
Yeah, okay.
It's a very endearing animal.
It is, I think. It is. But, it doesn't fight, so it lacks that sort of dynamism. And actually, that's what I want to get to. Hey, Alex here. You've reached the end of the free show. If you want to hear the last part of our interview with Paolo Gerbaudo, as well as a discussion between myself, George, and Phil, discussing what we've learned in the interview, unpicking a little bit further these questions about the politics of fear, about whether we really are moving to a protective state, about whether control is the means of protection or vice versa, and further questions beyond that. And the big one, of course, about whether we are moving beyond neoliberalism and what that will look like. That is over for subscribers only on Patreon. If you'd like to join us, please do. It's at patreon.com/bungacast, and that second part is out now. Hope to see you there. Bye-bye. Bye.